Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on inequality and difference. Friends, under the series we are going to talk on poverty and social exclusion. This is the topic of today's discussion, where we are going to give you in-depth knowledge. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Whip. Dr. Shruti Whip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Whip persistently and continuously makes efforts so that all the students are benefited as a whole. And dear friends, we believe that you always get in-depth knowledge through her too. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Whip through our live session, then you need to talk to us. For talking to us, you can contact us through a toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Friends, you are just requested to call us in the last 10 minutes, as well as you are also requested to ask questions relevant to the topic only. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Whip, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika, thanks a lot for this opportunity. As was introduced by Geetika, today's topic is poverty and social exclusion. This in fact is going to sum up all the topics that we have discussed so far, because as you all know, the title of the series is inequality and difference. So here we would be talking about various variables as to caste, class, community, ethnicity and gender, and how the issue of inequality and difference pervades all these variables, and how at the core lies the issue of poverty, and as a result of poverty and as a result of so many differences which remain unequal, and which are the issue of inequality is not really taken up seriously. So the result of all this is social exclusion. So the whole concept of social exclusion has to be understood as the central focus of this topic, and not as one separate topic. And this is what I have attempted to attempt in this lecture. I have tried to bring about a more holistic and a more integrated discussion. Now, the issue that arises right at the beginning of the lecture is that why should we care about social exclusion? Differences are bound to be there, and not everyone can be equal, and not everyone can achieve a status that is at par with the rest. So why so much discussion about the whole issue of social exclusion? First of all, the issue of social exclusion is related to the issue of human rights, so therefore it is very important that you as students of social science must be careful and must be attentive about this problem, and you all must be well aware of the research that has been undertaken in this area, so that you are aware of the problems and are also able to come up with the solutions. So the lack of human rights that come with the exclusion is something that cannot be acceptable in today's world, because we are not living in primitive times, and we are not living in a society which is only guided by the rules of survival for the fittest. So therefore we have to be concerned about others, and this concern must incorporate our concern for the poor, for the underprivileged, for the marginalized groups of society. Then also another very logical reason that why we should know about social exclusion is the fact that if the problem of social exclusion is tackled, and if we are able to deal with the problem in a more positive way, then this will have an overall positive impact on the economic growth of the country also. So therefore, it is not only a social or a cultural construct, rather one can also highlight the usefulness of political participation, more equitable political participation, more responsive citizenship, and also a more balanced and a more versatile economic growth. So therefore, all this will also help in meeting with the Millennium Development Goals, the goals that have been set at an international level by UN, and unless and until the issue of social exclusion is tackled in a far more active and in a far more proactive manner, no country can achieve Millennium Development Goals in stipulated a set of time. Now, coming to the definition of social exclusion, as to how social exclusion can be defined, I would like to reiterate some key points. For example, social exclusion can be defined as a process whereby groups of people who are existing in all societies are systematically disadvantaged because they are discriminated against. So therefore, both discrimination and disadvantage go hand in hand, and this can occur in public institutions such as the legal system, or in education or in health services, as well as in the household and in the community. So therefore, there is no sector which is left untouched, or no sector left which does not experience social seclusion. So therefore, this problem has a much wider connotation, and merely by looking at the definition, one cannot really understand the proportions of the problem that exist. Now, another very valid question that arises here is that how do people become excluded? Because for example, in a democratic sovereign socialist country like India, there is a constitution and there are constitutional guarantees for equality, for freedom. So then how come social exclusion still happens, and how come after so many decades of independence it is still continuing? So therefore, there are certain processes that are work, and these are both tangible as well as intangible, which need to be understood. And in order to solve the problem of social exclusion, we need to first understand as to how it happens and why it happens in the first place. Exclusion occurs when powerful groups of people in a society, they create institutions and promote behaviors that reflect or enforce current social attitudes. So therefore, it is always the powerful, those who are not only wielding power, and this is not only political power that I am talking about, but also social power, cultural power and economic power, that they set the rules, and once these rules have been set, they have to be followed invariably, and therefore those who are not used to following such lifestyle or adhering to such norms, they gradually start becoming excluded from the way of life, from a particular way of life that has been championed, that has been projected as the valid way of life by those who are in power. So therefore, these rules leave very little room for those who are different, and it is here that one can also talk about the whole concept of social capital, the idea that was generated by Bourdieu, which I have already discussed in detail in one of the earlier lectures. So I would request the students to go back to that lecture and refer to what Bourdieu has to say. This is a very important sociological concept which talks about as to how the rich and the powerful, they have their own social capital to fall back on. They have their own spheres of influence, and they have their own community which supports them and which is always there to help them, whereas those who are outside this core group, they have no capital to fall back on. So capital may not be only be understood in economic terms, but also in social, cultural and political terms. Now, how do people get excluded? The fact that we were discussing. So in order to solve the problem, we have to understand why do people get excluded, and that's what precisely we are trying to do. So therefore, sometimes this exclusion, how it happens, is on purpose, and at other times it is the unofficial discriminations that happen and which reflect the society's ideals at that time, and this is particularly so in a for a country like India, which has had historico, socio-cultural and religious legacy of exclusion, and therefore it is just that particular norms are considered as historicized in the psyche, and they continue to be generated from generations to generations. So another grave problem that exists is that the socially excluded groups are also poor. So therefore, poverty and social exclusion, they both go hand in hand, and it is not as if they are existing as separate entities. Rather, they are quite interconnected, and one leads automatically to the other. People, men, women or children who are excluded from society are also excluded from participation in the economy or in politics, and therefore they are likely to remain poorer than the rest, and this trend continues. Then so therefore it becomes very difficult to break the poverty cycle because of the over dominance of exclusionary frameworks. Now, another very important question that has been raised by many scholars and that has been answered by economists is that can social exclusion cause poverty, because exclusion in this sense is a social phenomenon, whereas poverty has largely been described as an economic phenomenon. So how come the two coexist, one social phenomenon and the other as economic or a cultural phenomenon? Now here one can give reference to some data. For example, for 891 million people in the world who experienced discrimination, this was largely the discrimination that was felt in the realm of ethnic, linguistic as well as religious identities. So therefore, it is but natural to understand both social exclusion and poverty as related and interrelated phenomenon. Because socially excluded groups don't have access to resources, to markets, to capital intensive investment schemes, to public services, health, education, etc. So therefore, they do not have an opportunity to increase their income in near future, because unless and until these groups get educated, they have good health facilities, they have access to the resources, how can we expect them to change their lives overnight and become lesser socially excluded or become come out of the cycle of poverty? So therefore, it's a vicious circle which needs to be broken only with a firm resolve and very strict policy guidelines. Therefore, as the economy grows in various countries, it is these groups which are left behind, and therefore it is important to understand the data that is available, and this will help us in understanding as to why and how these socially excluded groups continue to remain poor. Now, there are some transnational examples of poverty, of hunger, of malnutrition, of poor health, which I am going to share with you, because it is important to understand the problem of social exclusion as not only a problem limited to India or limited to the developing countries, rather it is a pan-national problem, and it is important to understand the international aspect also, which is implicit in this issue. So, for example, for a country like Vietnam, while 90% of the country is made up of ethnic minorities, the kind of development which is available and the kind of resources that are enjoyed by the 10% of the population far supersede that than that has been enjoyed by the indigenous people. Then in Vietnam, for example, 100 million older people live on less than $1 a day, which is hardly anything, and which is not even able to sustain them. Then women account for nearly 70% of the 1.2 billion people currently living in extreme poverty. So, here you can see that how it is not only the marginalization of the ethnic community which is the problem, but rather gender is also a major problem, and even within that core even within that ethnic group, there is the core problem, that is of marginalization of women who are poorer than the rest. Then if we come to the issue of maternal and child mortality, here one can give an example of Brazil, which has nearly 3 times as many colored women as white women who are dying from the complications of pregnancy and childbirth. So therefore, you can well imagine the plight of colored women who are not even able to make use of the basic health facilities. So another example one can give from India, where the discrimination of girl increases the child mortality rate by 20%, and we all know by now the issue of declining sex ratio and the issue of much higher mortality rate among the girl fetus. Then in another example of Guatemala, where the 79 out of 1000 indigenous babies and children, they die before the age of 5. So this again proves the point that the indigenous people belonging to ethnic groups, minorities and the excluded groups are the ones who are bearing the brunt of poor health facilities, or they are just not able to make use of whatever limited resources they are for rest of the rest of the population. Now, coming to the issue of education, here also one can point out the discriminatory practices that continue to exist. So, for example, in areas like Serbia and Montenegro, 30% of Roma children have never attended even primary schools. So, these 30% of children are not only deprived of access to basic health facilities, but also basic primary education, and therefore, how the question that arises is that how are they going to break the poverty cycle, because unless and until they are able to acquaint themselves of basic life skills, of getting skilled for the job market, they would continue to remain deprived and impoverished. Then another example that can be given is that of Uttar Pradesh, where the primary school enrollment data among girls shows that girls belonging to low castes register almost 30% of enrollment in the primary school education, whereas the same enrollment pattern, if we consider for girls belonging to the upper castes, it becomes 60%. So here one can talk about not only gender related inequality, but also caste comes to play a very important role, and so therefore girls belonging to lower castes do not have the same kind of access to primary education, and this we are talking only about primary education. So the question of access to secondary education or higher education becomes further complicated, where the issue of caste as well as gender and then also class comes to play a very important role. Then coming to the issue of gender equality, here one can give reference to data pertaining to women participation in politics world over. So a very interesting data that has emerged is that women hold fewer than 13% of the world's parliamentary seats and less than 9% of seats in the developing countries. Here there are some exceptions, of course, as you all must have noticed recently there was a news about Spain, where there has been a provision that almost 50% of the seats would be reserved for women, and rather the current situation is such that 60% of the MPs are women there. But then these are some exceptions, and if we consider women participation on a whole in politics, and if we are specifically talking about India, the situation is not very encouraging. 16 to 50% of women in relationships have either been physically assaulted or they have been mentally tortured. Now this is another very disturbing trend that has emerged over a period of time, and this again speaks volumes about gender inequality. Then if we talk about health, one can share data pertaining to various diseases like malaria, HIV, AIDS, etc. And here one can give example of a country like China, which is on a steady path of development, but here ethnic minorities which make almost 9% of the population. So while rest of the population has much better access to health and nutrition, it is among the 9% of ethnic minorities that they account for 37% of HIV AIDS cases. So here again this is a stark example of how ethnicity continues to remain an issue to reckon with, even for a developing even for a vibrant economy like China. So another example that one can give of is that of Africa, where 8% of the 15 to 19 year olds are living who are living with HIV or AIDS are women. So therefore showing that how it is the female population which is far more susceptible to exploitation and which is far more at a greater risk of acquiring these deadly diseases and viruses. Now even in a country like Guatemala, where 90% of children of European descent are vaccinated against deadly diseases, measles, etc. If we talk about the indigenous population, only 70% of the population is vaccinated against these diseases. So therefore this issue of indigenous population being exposed to greater risk because their being belonging to certain excluded groups continues to pervade all over, and it is not as if the problem is persistent in India. Now social exclusion invariably results in conflict, and this again has been a tendency world over because excluded groups are denied a genuine voice in politics, and even if they have been given some participation, namesake participation in politics, when it comes down to translating their voices into practice and implementing what they demand, the result is rather not encouraging. So therefore when these excluded groups feel abused, they feel neglected, they raise their voice, they mobilize themselves, they emerge as strong groups who start objecting to the strong hand with which the state rules over them, and therefore this results in the marginalized groups becoming violent and taking the law in their own hands. So therefore, the whole issue of violence and the whole issue of feeling more powerful after taking recourse to violence becomes norms of the day, and there are so many instances not only in India but world over where you can see ethnic conflicts, where you can see minorities becoming violent and raising their voices against the majority opinion. So here one can again give example of long drawn out civil war that has been growing on in a number of countries, for example Guatemala, and there are so many other examples one can talk of, and then the genocide, the Rwanda genocide, and you know, the whole world living in turbulent times and ethnic conflicts breaking out almost everywhere, and even in places which were unheard of in the past. So therefore, having discussed these various details, now I would like to talk about the issues that have emerged out of these various discussions. So one important issue that emerges is that the high poverty level goes hand in hand with the socially exclusionary policies, and it is not only a social, cultural, ethnic, gender, race, religion or other group identity related issue. Rather, all these issues are working hand in hand, and no particular issue can be considered as more important than the other. Now I shall be taking a break and then resume the lecture soon, where we would be taking up some more details pertaining to the problems related to social exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session in our series on inequality and difference. Dear friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break and would be discussing more on poverty and social exclusion. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on poverty and social exclusion. This is the topic of discussion, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is an assistant professor in Department of History, PGTAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Webb is a prolific professor, and we believe that we always get in-depth knowledge through her on various topics and issues. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Webb on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Webb, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Gitika. Thanks a lot. So we were discussing consequences of social exclusion. Now, if we talk about the economic consequences of social exclusion, then these are not direct consequences, but they are rather indirect consequences. One indirect consequence is on economic growth. That is the growth that an economy registers if there is a lot of social exclusion in that society compared to one which does not have any exclusionary compared to an economy in which there is no social exclusion worth talking of, then the result in both the cases are bound to be different, because discrimination, any kind of discrimination, leads to imperfect market mobilization and also imperfect market situation. This is also bound to impact demand and supply equation, and imperfection of any kind, when we are talking in terms of economy, it brings less than optimum allocation of resources. And if the optimum level is not really taken care of, then there are bound to be imperfections, there are bound to be gaps, and at the end of the day, when we talk about the profit, it is bound to be impacted. So therefore, the economic outcome is less than optimum if there is poverty and if there is social exclusion. So therefore, it is not only for the sake of human rights or for the sake of socio-cultural factors or for the sake of morality that one should be skeptical of social exclusion. Rather, even in terms of practical understanding, it is far more better to live in a society in which there is no social exclusion, because then the optimum utilization of resources can be made and the outcome would be far better. Another very valid concern is that of the issue of unemployment, which is bound to be there if our economic resources are not really especially the human resources are not utilized to their maximum. And then of course, the problem of civil rights and a lack of political participation, which in turn leads to so many inequalities and discriminatory trends that we have already discussed. So for example, low ownership of income earning assets, as well as the issue of declining employment, as well as the issue of declining wage earning. Then also the issue of unskilled population due to lack of education, due to lack of opportunities, and also all these trends ultimately have an impact on the employability of population. So unless and until the population gets converted into human resource through skills, through education, through proper training, there can be no talk of employability, there can be no talk of proper resource generation. So therefore, all this leads to low income generation as well as high poverty, and when one is talking about the civil and the political rights, the lack of political participation ultimately brings about weakening of democratic ties. It brings about mockery of not only democracy but also a weak governance. There are gaps in the governance which cannot be filled unless and until the citizens are more forthcoming and they are participating in the political process in a more active and in a more responsible manner. Then intergroup inequality, any kind of intergroup inequality generates intergroup conflict, and if we have to create a society which is not only equal but also a peace loving society, it is imperative that we deal with the issue of inter community rivalry, and we deal with the problem of inequality which is persistent among different groups. So therefore, if we are talking about greater political participation, or we are talking about a better a country which is devoid of ethnic conflicts, which is devoid of warfare, which is devoid of conflict of any kind, it is very important to deal with the issue of economic inequality, because that is at the root, that is at the root of the problem. So the root of the problem is not only social discrimination. Economic discrimination is equally important, and unless and until this gap between the rich and the poor is bridged, and the differences in the acquiring of resources is taken care of, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots, or the rich and the poor, is taken care of in a far more practical way, and some result oriented strategies are planned, nothing is going to change, because laws have been there, our constitution has been there, but still social discrimination and exclusion continues. Now, suggesting some remedies against exclusion. One, of course, can be compensatory measures of economic and educational empowerment. Here one can talk about also the role played by affirmative action that was undertaken by our constitution framers, and which has been implemented till date, and which is going to be implemented in future also, because the poor and the marginalized still continue to be devoid of their natural rights, and they still continue to remain without access to so many important resources. So therefore, compensatory measures are very important, and affirmative action, that is reservation, not only in educational institutions, but also in gaining employment, in in so many other fields of life, continues to play a very important role. And this is also going to bring about educational empowerment, and this is very important if they have to come out of the slumber of poverty and social exclusion. So therefore, besides affirmative action, there are some other actions also that one can talk about, and one very important action can be redistribution of land and resources, as well as redistribution of non-land assets, so that the poor and the deprived also have access to resources, and they also have something to call of their own. Then the capital and entrepreneur skills for business, instilling entrepreneurship, also providing them with proper skills, so that they can, the poor and the underprivileged, they can also become self-reliant, and they are not only dependent on the doles given by the government. Then of course, the educational development, about which I have already discussed in detail in the past. So here I am just touching upon the point. And then the provision of housing and social amenities. These are some of the core strategies that have been discussed time and again in order to help the poor and the socially excluded groups to become more empowered and to become more resourceful. Then another important factor that one can talk about is equal opportunity policy. Here one can discuss the legal safeguards, that is the anti-discrimination laws that must be enforced, so that people belonging to the marginalized groups have law on their side, and once whenever there is a need for them to raise their voice, they have law on their side, so that they feel more empowered and they are able to have the wrongs addressed. Then the equal and fair share in income earning assets. This again is not only an economic endeavor, but also a socio-cultural and political endeavor, where the government of the day has to ensure that the resources are equitably enjoyed and the profit that is generated is equitably enjoyed by all. Then the issue of employment, education, housing, all this can be discussed with reference to affirmative action, where primacy is given to the marginalized groups from time to time, so that they are able to come at par and they are able to match rest of the population. And then of course their increasing participation in executive and in governance. Then another very important factor which will help any government to take important decisions and also to implement policies which are fruitful policies is the recourse to data. So, data generation which can speak volumes about how, when, where, how much of inequality is there, and once this kind of data is available and people also have access to that data, and it is not only a government property, it becomes a very important way to understand how things have changed and what needs to be done. So, any kind of futuristic planning needs to have recourse to this kind of data, and both visible and invisible data systems need to be in place. Now, there need to be some focus areas when we are talking about the issue of social exclusion. So, there has to be focus on certain groups which historically have been excluded from the development process and which have been discriminated against. So, for example, we can talk about the SC community, then the STs, the scheduled tribes, then women, then also some other groups who have not really participated in the development process the way the other communities have, for example, Muslims, OBCs and people with disabilities. So, these so any kind of data related to these groups and gender can be a common entity in all these groups, because women in all these communities, even in the marginalized communities, it is the women who are discriminated the most. So, any kind of data must be gender sensitive, and the policies also that are devised from time to time need to be so. Now, in this regard, I would like to make passing reference to the national data which students can access and which they must go through from time to time as students of social science in order to widen their horizon and in order to understand the contemporary times and how the times are changing. Say for example, you can compare the data pertaining to 2011 census, you can compare it to probably 1901, or even after independence you can compare it to 1951. So, it is in this regard that NSS, NFHS and other qualitative and quantitative data analysis that are available must be taken care of by the students. Now, however, all these data analysis and quantitative and qualitative analysis of whatever available data is there, these are not just outcomes, but they are processes. So, therefore, they help us in understanding the changing trends. Income poverty, inequality, all these are not only elements of social exclusion, and unless and until we consider them as holistic processes, our understanding would remain incomplete. So, a very important measure which can help the students in understanding this is Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of the degree of variation which is represented in a set of values and especially in measuring income inequality. So, when we are talking about poverty, Gini coefficient is a very important and very valid statistical measure which can help as a very important analytical tool as well. And however, one major problem with data is that aggregate data, any kind of aggregate data, does not really capture heterogeneity. Heterogeneity means the differences that exist and the diversity that exists. So in order to deal this problem, what we need is the qualitative analysis. So both the quantitative as well as qualitative analysis, which means triangulation of data, is important to undertake any valid research on poverty and social exclusion. Now, poverty and social exclusion also have global dimensions. It is not as if the problem is only rooted in India, or it is only a problem which is found in the traditional societies. So, for example, even in Europe, there are excluded communities, for example, the Romas, as I just shared with you that how Romas, they do not have access to education, and 30% of the children belonging to Roma community have never gone to schools. Then in addition to ethnic minorities, there are migrants who do not have access to the kind of access the other communities have to the resources. So, migrant workers continue to remain marginalized, continue to remain deprived. Then for countries like India and Nepal, caste is a major variant, and when one is talking about exclusion, caste plays a very important role. Then for Brazil, people of African descent continue to remain discriminated against, and they continue to live socially excluded lives. Then world over, indigenous people, that is the original inhabitants of the land, continue to remain deprived. They have not really been able to make use of the of the development that their economies, their countries have gone through. So therefore, the indigenous inhabitants of America, the Red Indians, etc., they continue to remain far more poorer and deprived than rest of the population. Now, there are some common features also. These features are not to be found only in a tradition bound society like India, but they are also found world over. So, since we are discussing the issue of social exclusion, it would be interesting to highlight as to what are some common features that can be identified as common phenomenon that are prevailing world over. So, wherever there is social exclusion, there is bound to be stigma attached to particular communities, and also stereotyping. So, both stigma and stereotyping, they continue to exist not only in India, but world over. Then there are some historical underpinnings. For example, there are specific legends that are associated with particular communities, and these legends continue to have their influence over the contemporary times also. Then there are some identifying characteristic features which have been earmarked specifically for certain races, ethnic communities, castes, region and religion. So, this also pertains to stereotyping and stigma. Then poor access to credit facilities, poor access to resources, to markets and to assets. This again is a common problem world over. And finally, low decision making power, because they have a much weaker political participation. So, therefore, their decision making power is also impacted. Now, having discussed these common features and some common trends that have existed world over, now we would be specifically talking about the issues that are related to the Indian subcontinent. So, here one can talk about scheduled tribes, then of course, the Dalits and women. these would be my core entry points for discussion on social exclusion and poverty. Now, while for scheduled tribes, the most important feature that identifies them and which kind of demarcates them from rest of the population is deprivation, then also poverty, and the way they have been displaced from their original homelands, an aspect that I had discussed in detail in my last couple of lectures. Then also another feature that identifies them is the excess mortality of tribal children due to very poor access to health facilities and therefore very high morbidity among the toddlers. Now, coming to the issue of Dalits and how social exclusion operates as far as the SCs and Dalits are concerned, here one can not only talk about the social discriminatory practices that were prevalent in the past, but also labor market outcomes as to how they are now contributing to the labor markets and how their participation continues to remain more focused at the lower levels of the hierarchy. Then another important category can be women. Here we can talk about the health and survival strategies, then the physical insecurity, the economic, the problem of economic dependence, and then disadvantages in the labor market as to how they continue to remain active in few kind of jobs only, and the problem of feminization of labor force which has happened as a result of globalization, where women are now concentrated more in particular kind of jobs which are not very high paying jobs, but probably it's more sales oriented jobs that they have started focusing on. Now, we would be taking up these categories one by one as part of the discussion. Now, coming back to the issue of scheduled tribes, there has been a systematic failure in giving the tribals a genuine stake in the development process and in the modern economic processes, thereby not only dislocating them from their original habitats, but also depriving them of finding their suitable place under the sun. So, both the problems are going hand in hand. On the one hand, while they are being displaced because their habitat is also the place where maximum natural minerals are found, abundant natural resources are found, which are needed by the multinational corporations, which are needed by the government of the day in order to bring about more and more development. So, they have to be dislocated and displaced, but at the end of the day, what they are getting in return of the lost lands which were so much fertile and with which they had so much of emotional attachment is probably land which is not only giving them 2 square meals of day. So, the alienation built over decades is now taking a violent turn in many parts of the country, and I have already given so many examples of how violently the tribal groups have started reacting to the kind of discrimination and to the kind of exploitation that has been going on for centuries. Now, relatively slower declines in poverty meant that concentration of STs in the poorest deciles of the population increased. So, therefore, even while after independence there has been development and the per capita income has gone up, STs continue to remain in that part of continue to remain part of the lowest class. In most states with high tribal populations, poverty rates for STs are much higher than the average tribal poverty rate across the nation as a whole. For example, here one can give an example of Orissa, where this rate is as high as 75%. Now, as you can see from this slide, this is basically, it gives you an idea of how STs in 2004 were 20 years behind the average population if we talk about poverty level. So, therefore, while development and economic upliftment was happening for rest of the population, the tribal groups were lagging behind by 20 years. Then another very important issue that is there related specifically to the tribal population is the issue of child mortality, and this again speaks volumes about tribal deprivation, because health and basic child care facilities are very basic health parameters, and in fact this is their basic right which must have been given to them. But STs have higher child mortality rates than rest of the population. Nearly 96 tribal children are dying for every 1000 births, compared to under 5 mortality of 74 per 1000 for the average Indian child. Now, this again has been a data that was generated by NFHS 2005. So, the child mortality rate among ST population is far higher than among rest of the population, which is a major concern. Then ST children make up nearly 12% of all children below the age of 5 in rural areas, but account for 23% of all deaths between 1 and 5 years of age. So, this proves that a disproportionate number of children are dying in rural areas, and these are tribal children. So, what are we doing to our tribal children? We are not even able to provide them security of life. We are not even able to provide them bare minimum survival facilities, and child mortality rates have rather stagnated among STs in rural areas over successive NFHS rounds. So, the successive NFHS rounds also do not show any marked difference in the child mortality rates among ST population, which shows that whatever health facilities are being provided are not really being utilized by the ST communities in a far more logical way, because if they would have been, then there would have been some improvement in the child mortality rates. So, breaking down under 5 mortality by age, we find that tribal children are on par with others. So, when a child is born, then they are still on par with the others, but they fall well behind by the time they are 5 years old. And this divergence is more striking when compared with SC children, who also face disadvantages, but then there is something problematic with ST children, that they are losing their lives much more than even SC children. So, having discussed all these details, I would like to show you a slide which shows you data pertaining to NFHS 2005-2006. Now, this shows that how tribal children start to fall behind after the age of 1. So, till the age of 1 year, when they are probably breastfeeding, they are still able to survive, but after that, when they are not really able to gain access to nutrition, proper nutrition and health facilities, they start losing their lives. Now, having discussed all these factors, I would like to now bring the lecture to an end, and we would continue with these problems, because the problems still remain to be discussed. Then we shall be doing that in the next lecture. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on poverty and social exclusion. Dear friends, we believe that you have lots of questions, and you to have tried calling to us, but due to the paucity of time, we are unable to take your calls. But we promise to give answers to your questions. If you have genuine questions or the questions related to the topic, then you can mail us your questions. Your questions will be taken in the next session when Dr. Shruti Vip visits our studio. You can write to us at info.cec@nic.in. So friends, we are going to meet again very soon and would be discussing more as said by Dr. Shruti Vip. With this note, thank you so very much. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Geetika.